It was around 1 in the morning when the Nita woke up, feeling thirsty. She went to the kitchen for a drink, then decided to check on her fiancé, Nopon, who was supposed to be asleep in the next room. The door to the room was slightly open, and Nopon was nowhere to be found. Something felt off, so the Nita quickly went upstairs to her mother's room. She had a bad feeling. When she put her ear to the door, she heard Nopon's voice inside. Hey, welcome back to our channel. Today, we've got an unbelievable real-life story for you, all the way from Udon Thani, Thailand. This one starts as a family feud between two brothers, but it quickly escalates into a full-on rivalry between a mother and her daughter. So, what's the deal with this crazy and complicated case? Let's dive in and find out. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this with your friends. Trust me, you don't want them to miss this one. So, let me introduce you to a couple from Udon Thani, Thailand. Meet Kasem, born in 1962, and his wife Chompu, who's 2 years younger than him. They tied the knot in 1987. Kasem comes from a wealthy family. His father and uncle ran multiple plantations and textile businesses since 1949, which put Kasem in a good position to join the family business. He and Chompu worked together in both industries, building a comfortable life. In 1989, their daughter the Nita was born. She was not only beautiful but also incredibly bright, with a natural gift for academics. The Nita was actually interested in following her father's footsteps and joining the family business. But Kasem had other plans. He urged her to pursue a college education and a career in finance, hoping she would move away from Udon Thani and find success in a big city. So the Nita enrolled in a well-known university in Udon Thani, and later moved to Khon Kaen, where she became a finance officer at a private bank. Now, since Kasem is an only child, it was just him and Chompu at home after the Nita moved away. But things between them weren't as peaceful as they seemed. Chompu, once known for her loud, flirtatious personality, had always caught Kasem's attention when they first met. He thought that as she got older, she'd mellow out. But it turns out, she only became more reserved around him, while still living a completely different life behind his back. After the Nita left for the city, Chompu started hanging out with younger men and drinking heavily. People in the community were aware of it, but they didn't want to cause trouble for Kasem, who was a respected figure in Udon Thani. Eventually, the truth came out when someone tipped Kasem off about his wife being caught with one of his employees at a hotel. Kasem was furious and fired the employee on the spot. But despite the betrayal, he couldn't bring himself to divorce Chompu. Kasem was concerned about the family's reputation, and even more so about how this would affect the Nita. He didn't want his daughter to be labeled as coming from a broken home, especially when her mother's behavior was far from ideal. So he made the tough decision to keep things quiet and cover up his wife's actions, all for the sake of protecting Thanita's future. Chompu promised to stay faithful from then on, and Kasem kept her secrets, hoping that one day, things would settle down. The truth was, almost all of the employees working for Kasem already knew about Chompu's antics, but they all swore to keep quiet. In early 2019, Mr. Kasem's health took a turn for the worse, and he had to start treatment at home. He decided to put some of his employees and his sister-in-law in charge of running the business, while his wife, Chompu, would handle the finances. Sadly, despite the treatment, Kasem's condition kept getting worse, and he passed away in January 2020. His daughter the Nita was completely devastated. She was ready to quit her job and go back home, but then she remembered her father's words. He had always told her to be a good banker. So she stayed in Khon Kaen, pushing through her grief. Luckily, her boyfriend Chayut, who had been by her side for a year, stuck with her through it all. Chayut, a year younger than the Nita, worked as an office network installer and troubleshooter. The two met because Chayut had been coming to Thanita's office to install or fix the network, and they hit it off. Chayut was totally smitten with the Nita, and even though she was younger, she thought he was a pretty smart guy, especially considering he only had a high school education. Then, in March 2020, 2 months after her father passed, Cheyut introduced the Nita to his older brother, Nopon. Nopon had just moved to Khon Kaen from Nakhon Ratchasima after losing his job due to the pandemic. He was looking for work, but Cheyut didn't know of any openings, so Nopon ended up staying in his small apartment. Over time, though, Nopon's presence became a burden. Cheyut's work was slowing down since so many businesses were shut down due to the pandemic, which meant less income. The Nita started helping Cheyut with his financial struggles. She'd bring him food and do whatever she could to support him. As they spent more time together, their bond grew even stronger. The Nita opened up to Cheyut about her father's passing and the family business, and it wasn't long before she suggested that Nopon go to Udon Thani to meet her mother and look for a job there. Everyone was on board, but they had to put it on hold since some places were still in lockdown at the time. During the 2 months that Nopon stayed at Cheyut's apartment, he and the Nita grew even closer. But then, in May 2020, something unexpected happened. Cheyut, bored one day, started going through his brother's phone. That's when he found a WhatsApp conversation between the Nita and Nopon that took him completely by surprise. The messages revealed a lot of things that Cheyut never knew about. Things that made him realize the Nita and his brother had been secretly in touch all this time. Naturally, Cheyut was furious. A huge argument broke out between the brothers, and it got physical. The Nita couldn't fix things between them. In the end, she apologized to Cheyut, admitting that she had developed feelings for his brother, Nopon, and that she loved him now. The confession hit Cheyut hard, and in his anger and disappointment, he left the apartment, disappearing for a while. Meanwhile, Nopon and the Nita went out together, and she continued to help him financially, even planning to marry him once he found a job. In 2020, the economy was still struggling, and things weren't getting any better for the Nita, either. Her job situation wasn't looking great as some of the sub-branches where she worked began to close, and many employees were laid off. Those who stayed had to be transferred to the main branch, which meant less work and a smaller paycheck for the Nita. To make matters worse, she was also supporting her unemployed boyfriend, Nopon. It was a tough time for her financially, but she tried to keep things together. Then, in July 2020, the Nita got a call from her mother, Chompu, who told her that Cheyut, the Nita's ex, had started working at one of their family plantations. Apparently, Chompu knew all about the end of their relationship, but the Nita didn't really feel like discussing it. She just told her mother that Cheyut was now working there, and that finding a job wasn't easy these days. She also asked her mother to keep an eye on Cheyut, as he was a decent guy, despite everything that had happened. A month later, the Nita, now 30, was busy making wedding plans with Nopon. The two of them had decided to go back to Udon Thani to talk things over with her mother. They needed financial help, especially since Nopon's family didn't have any money to contribute. Chompu was their only hope to cover the costs of the wedding. So, the Nita and Nopon stayed in Udon Thani to discuss the wedding plans with her mom. But then came the real shocker. Chompu announced that she was getting married too, and to none other than Cheyut, the Nita's ex. Naturally, the Nita was floored. Her mother had only been widowed for 6 months, and now she was already planning to marry Cheyut, who was not only her ex but also her future son-in-law's brother. The Nita couldn't believe it. There was no way her mom would get remarried so soon, especially to someone like Cheyut. But Chompu didn't care about the Nita's shock. She was in love, and as far as she was concerned, it didn't matter what people thought. They could say whatever they wanted, but she and Cheyut were going to live their lives the way they wanted. Chompu even boldly declared that Cheyut would take over the plantation and textile businesses once they were married. The Nita was furious, but there was nothing she could do about it. Nopon tried talking to his younger brother Cheyut, telling him he should stop acting weird and maybe look for a wife closer to his age. But Cheyut didn't care. He was set on what he wanted. The Nita even went to talk to 2 of her uncles about it, hoping they'd have some advice. But all they said was that her father had once told her she could remarry if she ever felt lonely. The Nita also asked her mother for her fair share of the inheritance, but it turned out that her father had only left her 15% of the wealth, while 80% went to her mother. The rest was set aside with the hope that the Nita would one day marry a rich man who could support her. This just made the Nita more suspicious. She started to wonder if her mother had planned everything. Her father's passing, the inheritance, the control of the business. But despite all her suspicions, she didn't have any proof to confront her mother. The tension continued to build. Her mother promised to cover all the wedding expenses if the Nita married, but the whole situation left the Nita feeling bitter, especially about her mom marrying Chayut. It was like everything she had worked for was unraveling right before her eyes, and she was powerless to stop it. After spending a week at her mother's house, Nopon's behavior started to shift. He became more distant toward the Nita and spent a lot of time chatting with her mother. He'd make coffee, drive her to the market, take her to the garden, pretty much anything to get her attention. There were even a few times when Nopon and Chayut argued over who would take Chompu's mother to the wedding. The Nita thought maybe Nopon was just trying to get noticed, especially since her mother-in-law-to-be was covering the wedding expenses. She decided to brush it off, though it did feel a bit off. Then, one night in mid-August 2020, as the Nita was getting ready for bed, she heard her mother yelling from the living room, "Chayut, you sleep in the next room tonight, because it's not your turn now." No need to resist. The Nita was confused and went out to check. She peeked into the next room, where Nopon was supposed to be sleeping, but the door was locked from the inside. She went back to her room, not sure what to think. Around 1 a.m., the Nita woke up and decided to get a drink from the kitchen. As she passed by the door to the next room, where Nopon was supposed to be, she noticed it was open. The room was empty. Immediately suspicious, she went upstairs to her mother's room. Her gut was telling her something wasn't right. She put her ear to the door, and sure enough, she heard Nopon's voice inside. It was then that the Nita's suspicions were confirmed. Nopon was in her mother's room. She knocked on the door in a panic, and when her mother opened it, she was with Nopon. Chompu's mother apologized but said everything that had happened was because Nopon had invited her into the relationship. Nopon then admitted that he had developed feelings for Chompu's mother and intended to break off the engagement with the Nita. He wanted to cancel their wedding plans altogether. The Nita was livid. She went back to her room, furious and heartbroken. The next morning, she packed up and left for Khon Kaen alone. Once there, the Nita called her two uncles to tell them what had happened. They immediately went to Chompu's house to give her a piece of their mind. But there was a catch. Her uncles were actually Chompu's younger siblings. Since Mr. Kasem had been the only child, Chompu still held all the power. She refused to listen to their warnings, brushing them off. In fact, she told them that she was trying to find the best partner, and that both Nopon and Chayut were competing to be her husband. She didn't care if they thought the men were just after her wealth. Chompu was convinced she was the idol of all idols, and no one could stop her from doing what she wanted. Then, on November 15, 2020, Chompu kicked Nopon out of her house and told him to go back to Khon Kaen and try to win the Nita back. But Nopon refused, saying that the Nita would never take him back. Chompu didn't care. She told him to go after the Nita no matter what it took, promising to cover all their wedding expenses if he succeeded in winning her back. Around 4 in the afternoon, Nopon made his way to one of the family's farms, where Chayut was supervising some workers. He had a knife hidden, and he pulled his sister behind a shed. Without warning, he attacked Chayut. There was some struggle, but in the end, Chayut was overpowered, and he died on the spot at just 29 years old. Nopon hoped no one had seen, but as luck would have it, there were workers nearby who witnessed the whole thing. They immediately called the police. 3 hours later, Nopon was found hiding among the trees in a city park and arrested. The news of Chayut's death sent shockwaves through Mrs. Chompu's family, but she didn't seem to care too much. With her wealth, she could always find another man. Then, just 2 days later, on November 17, 2020, a woman named Outrage showed up at Chompu's house, furious. Outrage believed that Chompu had seduced her husband, a policeman named Boonmi. Outrage brought her sister, Cherowan, and the two of them went on a rampage. They even fired bullets at Mrs. Chompu. At 55 years old, Mrs. Chompu didn't survive the attack. Afterward, Outrage and Cherowan turned themselves in to the police. Meanwhile, all of this was a huge shock to the Nita. However, strangely, she didn't feel sad about it. Her uncle from Udon Thani called her, asking her to come back and take care of the family house. According to the lawyer, the will stated that her mother would inherit the lion's share of the estate. But with Mrs. Chompu gone, everything would now go to the Nita automatically, since her mother never had a chance to make a new will. When the police spoke with the Nita, they explained that Nopon had been deeply shocked by the amount of money Mrs. Chompu had. Having grown up in poverty, he was desperate to take control of the wealth and businesses, especially now that Cheyut was out of the picture. Nopon had no intention of letting his younger brother get anything. His relationship with Cheyut had soured after Cheyut and the Nita broke up, and he didn't want to let him have the fortune that came with it. The police also told the Nita that Nopon was just a young man with a junior high school education and a history of unstable jobs. He had always struggled with insecurity but was surprisingly good with women. In fact, the Nita found out that before he got engaged to her, Nopon had been married twice but was abandoned both times because he wasn't reliable. This was a sharp contrast to Cheyut, who was more educated and honest. The Nita couldn't help but feel regret for choosing Nopon over Cheyut. Looking back, she realized just how wrong she had been. At Nopon's trial on April 19, 2021, at the Udon Thani High Court, there wasn't a single witness who could speak in his defense. The 32-year-old was ultimately sentenced to life in prison for the premeditated murder of his own sister, the Nita, and for stealing some of Mrs. Chompu's jewelry, which was found in his pocket when he was caught. As for the case involving Mrs. Chompu, Outrage, and her sister Cherowin, the motive behind the attack was revealed to be Outrage's belief that Mrs. Chompu had been seducing her husband, Boon Mi, who had rejected her. Outrage and Mrs. Chompu had argued about this issue multiple times. But because Mrs. Chompu was wealthy and influential, she had boldly declared that she would take Boon Mi from Outrage. According to several witnesses, it was also revealed that Mrs. Chompu had once attempted to burn down Outrage's home. Matters only escalated as Boon Mi was frequently lured into meetings with Mrs. Chompu with promises of money, until Outrage, with the help of lawyer Vipin Kumar, finally took legal action against her husband for misconduct. The Udon Thani High Court delivered its verdict on June 13, 2021. Outrage was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and her younger sister Cherowin received a 10-year sentence for their roles in Mrs. Chompu's murder. The weapons they used were traced back to Boon Mi's police officer-issued gun, which had been taken from his closet. A month later, through further legal efforts, Boon Mi was sentenced to 5 months in prison for misconduct in his affair with Mrs. Chompu, which had been conducted behind his wife's back. Meanwhile, the Nita settled fully in Udon Thani and, with her uncle's help, continued her father's plantation and textile business. As of now, there's no news of her getting married, even though she's 32. Maybe she's still dealing with the trauma of everything that happened, or perhaps she's just waiting for the right person. Either way, let's send our thoughts and prayers her way. What lessons can we learn from this story?